what if I said the knight moves 1,000 times? What color would he be on? The knight is the trickiest McTrickster of the bunch because the knight has some special powers. But please, don't call him a horse. My horse, my horse, my kingdom for a horse. Who are you, Richard III? No, we're not back to the Middle Ages. We are here in the 21st century talking about the knight's tricky moves. Now, the knight is the only piece in chess that moves in basically two different directions at once, and it's the only piece in chess that can jump over other pieces. In short, the knight moves in the shape of the capital letter L. Let's go way back to kindergarten, where we learned how to make our capital letters. The knight moves 1, 2, then he stops and makes a turn and moves one more. And you can see how that makes the shape of a capital L. Here, I'll even color in the squares for you. That certainly makes an L. Now, unlike what you learned in kindergarten, you can also make backward L's and your teacher will not grade you incorrectly. 1, 2, we can go the other way. Backward L's do count. Well, wait a minute. What about if we start out by going sideways? 1, 2, and then we turn upward. That's kind of like an L chillin', lying on his back, and that still counts. The knight could have also gone 1, 2, and then turned downward. That would also work. In fact, let's just go ahead and complete our entire knight foray, if I can use that word, and the knight can go to all of these final arrow squares. You can actually count all the destination squares that knight can move to. In fact, I'm going to color them in again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. The knight can move to those 8 different squares. He cannot stop along the way. He has to complete the capital L. Now, one very interesting thing about those squares, even though I made them red, you can see they're actually dark squares. They are blue squares. But what color is the knight starting on? Well, he's starting on a light square. This is a very important feature of the knight. The knight can't tell which color he likes better. He constantly is changing his color. In fact, he must change his color every single turn. To prove that to you, we're going to hop around with Mr. Knight. So, the knight is clearly on a light square. Let's have him go 1, 2, and then make a turn. He's clearly on a dark square. Let's have him do an upside down L. 1, 2, turn. He's obviously on a light square. The knight will always change colors. In fact, let's do a little math puzzle for you. If the knight is on a light square, as he is right here, and he moves 2 turns, what color will he end up on at the end of the second turn? Well, you can probably figure it out, because if he's on light, at the end of the first move, he'll be in a dark square. Then at the end of the second move, he has to go back to the light square. Let's test this out. 1, 2, turn. At the end of his first move, he is on dark. 1, 2, turn. At the end of his second move, he's back on light. In fact, you could even do really big numbers. What if I said the knight moves 1,000 times? What color would he be on? Well, 1,000 is actually an even number. So if the knight is on a light square and he moves an even number of times, he will end up on a light square. Will I actually move the knight 1,000 times to prove this to you? No, dear YouTuber friends, because I think we've got better things to do. Now, what if the knight moves 1,001 times? Ooh, would that make him an Arabian knight? You see what I did there? If the knight moves 1,001, that's an odd number of moves, so he would end up on the other color square. Am I going to move him 1,001? No. Go read the book. It's better than the chess game, for once. Okay, now, I also mentioned that this knight has special powers. He can jump over other things just like a horse. But please don't actually call him a horse. That hurts my ears. A knight is what professional chess players say. Now, the knight can jump over any piece on the board, his own pieces, or the other team's pieces. So, if I put a black pawn right here, the knight can jump over it just like it's not even there. You can maybe tap him on the head, but you can't actually bother him. You have to leave that pawn where it is, but make sure you count the square. So for example, the knight moves 1, 2, turn, and he ends up on the exact same square that he would have even if that pawn was not there. But remember to count the square. Do not, repeat, do not do this. Warning, warning, do not move over the pawn and say 1, 2, turn, because look at that. He will have gone from a light square to a light square, and we know that is absolutely not possible. If instead of a black pawn, that was, let's say, a white rook, look how I just made a change there. The knight can still jump over the rook. There's absolutely no change. 1, 2, turn, and the knight still ends up on that G5 square. Now, if the knight is lucky enough to land on a piece, that is how a knight captures. So let's put a poor defenseless bishop right here. Sorry, Mr. Bishop, but we needed you. The knight can move 1, 2, turn, and land on top of the bishop and simply remove it from the chessboard. Now, a very few chess teachers out there teach that the knight moves 1 and then turns and goes 1, 2. I find that to be a little bit weird, but not wrong. If the knight moves 1 and then turns and goes 1, 2, it's still the shape of an L. However, what I like for my chess kids to do is to count 1, 2, turn. It just seems a little bit more natural to me. Okay, let's have some fun. Let's add some stuff to the chessboard. Look at this crazy position. Now I've added a whole bunch of black pieces, and I've got a very simple question to you, chess kids. Which black piece can the white knight capture? Can you figure it out? All right, well, let's start with this pawn.
Hello.
Already, we know that cannot possibly be right because that pawn is sitting on a light square. Let's get rid of the red and, I revealed a light square. If the knight is on a light square, he cannot move to a light square. Remember, when you jump over the rook, you count that square. We go 1, 2, and turn, wah, wah, wah. That's a blank square. This pawn is on the correct color, but he's too far away. We're not doing super duper giant L's, okay? What about the rook? Well, the rook is actually too close. Notice a knight actually cannot capture pieces that it's right beside. Very strange feature of the knight. What about the queen?
Hello.
Well, she's on a light square. That can't work. 1, 2, and I'm holding my breath. But I have to say turn at some point. I can go up or I can go down, but I cannot just sit there on the queen. By now, of course, you figured out the right answer is Mr. Bishop. That bishop, that poor bishop, is our cannon fodder once again, or I should say our knight's dinner. This is the cannon, and rooks don't go diagonal, so that was a bad analogy. The knight is going to have some dinner. Here we go. 1, 2, turn, and of course the bishop gets removed from the board. Now, remember, this rook could swing over and capture the knight on the next turn, but so be it. Both players got a piece. All right. Now, moving on, what about this really, really wild position? Oh yeah, the knight is going to the pawn disco, and what is the knight going to be able to capture first? Well, here we actually have a couple of choices. We can go 1, 2, and we can turn left, or we can turn right. Now, which way do you want me to turn? Yell it out. Yell louder. I can't hear you. Okay, obviously, I still can't hear you, so I'm just going to pick one. Did you pick 1, 2, turn to the right? Did you? Did you? Maybe because I'm right-handed? I don't know. Okay, if you picked left, that's okay, but we're going to go with right. Now, the knight can now capture this pawn next. Here we go. 1, 2, turn. Okay, what can we capture next? From here on out, by the way, we only have one option. I think here we have to go 1, 2, turn. Bang, we got that one. Okay, what about next? Well, I'm on a dark square. Got to go to a light square. We've only got 2 pawns left in the light squares. Remember, that one's too close. So we have to go 1, 2, turn, capital L. Take that, kindergarten teacher. Actually, Miss Sears, if you're out there still, thank you for making me a good speller. Okay, here we go with the knight next. 1, 2, turn. Got that one. 1, 2, turn. Got that one. 1, 2, turn. Got that one. And, Okay, we cannot capture this pawn, but this brings us to our next discussion. The knight sometimes has to make a really tricky plan in order to get to a square that it's very close to. Okay, so for example, if this knight wants to capture this pawn, it can do it in 2 turns. I can name that pawn capture in 2 turns, but the first move is the key move. Now, in most cases in life, when you want something, you want to go toward it. But if this knight goes toward the pawn, watch what happens. 1, 2, turn. Uh-oh, now I'm too close to the pawn. Let's go back. What if we go 1, 2, turn? Again, you're too close. So the knight, quite strangely, often has to move away from its target to be able to come back and capture the target. Now, you don't want to go too far away. For example, 1, 2, turn, that's just being a little bit shy, and the knight needs to be a little bit more brave than that. Let's go back. Let's try 1, 2, but we turn away from the pawn. Now on the next turn, we can go 1, 2, and turn to capture the pawn. And by the way, in this position, there was another option. The knight could move 1, 2, and turn this way, as crazy as that looks. And then finally, 1, 2, turn and capture that pawn on the next move if the pawn is still sitting there. But something tells me that pawn would have probably run away. Let's move on and see how the knight works on an open board instead of in a small space. We've done this before, but now we're going to do the knight maze. Can the knight figure his way through the maze? Remember the rules. The knight must capture one black pawn every turn until they're all captured. What can the knight capture on the first move? 1, 2. That's not going to work. We forgot to turn. We can jump over this pawn. That's about it. That pawn's too far away and on the wrong color. That pawn's in a straight line. We really only have one option left that's reasonable. We can go 1, 2, turn. On the next turn, 1, 2, turn. Now you can see the maze actually gets pretty easy. 1, 2, turn. On the next move, 1, 2, turn. And without me even moving the knight, can you figure out the final 4 moves for the knight? Let's see if we can do this without moving the knight at all. 1, 2, turn. 1, 2, turn. 1, 2, turn. This reminds me of the dance class that I should have taken earlier in life. And 1, 2, turn. And the knight captures all of those pawns. Now we're going to actually move the knight. And by the way, when you get to be a more experienced knight mover, a jouster perhaps, you don't even often count 1, 2, turn. You just pick up the knight and move him to his destination. If you see Magnus Carlsen count 1, 2, turn, I'm going to say, who is that dressed up like Magnus Carlsen? Because he simply picks up the knight and lands it where he wants it to go, and he does it again, and he will probably capture all of your pieces because he definitely captures all of mine when we play. Now, if we move on to the starting position, the reason I want to show you this is because the knight is actually the only big piece from the back row that can actually move on the first turn. You can clearly see all of the white pawns can move. That's pretty obvious. But the knight, because it can jump over the pawns, is the only other piece that can move in the starting position of chess. So this knight, if it wants to, can come 1, 2, and grandmasters like to go toward the middle of the board. He would probably stop on f3, and that's actually a pretty reasonable starting move. In fact, I have a challenge question for you as I reset the chessboard. On white's first move of the chess game, how many different ways could white start the game on move 1? They don't have to be good moves, they just have to be allowable moves. Count them all up, and when you have your answer, stand up on top of your chair and yell it out the window. No, don't do that. Maybe you're riding the school bus and that would make the other drivers scared. Okay, but anyway, pause your video, count them all up, and you can unpause when you have the answer. Okay, if you're back, you probably counted the pawns first, but if you counted the knight moves first, that's okay. Take a look at this pawn right in front of the king. He can go 1 square. Remember, pawns can always go 1, but that pawn is also on the first move, so it has the option of going 2 squares. And in fact, all 8 white pawns have 2 options. So if you're good at addition, you'll do 8 plus 8, but if you're better at multiplication, you could do 8 times 2. Either way, you're going to get the same answer. There are 16 different pawn moves. Of course, some are better than others, but they are all moves, okay? But we're not done because we just learned how the knight moves. And the knight on g1 has 2 options. He can go 1, 2, and stop on f3, or he could have turned the other way to go to h3. And of course, you've got another knight sitting down there on b1. Hey guys, don't forget about me. And that knight also has 2 options. 1, 2, turn. Or he could have turned the other way. Collectively, that means that we have 2 knights with 2 options each. 2 plus 2 or 2 times 2. Either way is 4. But don't forget about your 16. 16 plus 4. And the grand total is 20. If you got 20, congratulations. And black also has 20 first moves as well. Moving on. In this position, we're going to do a little bit more knight planning, okay? In the next couple of positions, I want you to take the knight and capture the black pawn in 2 moves. Okay, where would the knight move first? In this particular example, the knight actually is going to go toward the pawn. There's no trickeration needed here. The knight could go 1, 2, turn, or we put the knight back on the starting square. He could have moved 1, 2, turn. If the knight goes to either of these two squares, the knight could capture that pawn in the next turn. In fact, let's make it more of a real-world scenario. Let's say the knight goes 1-2 turn. Of course, in real life, black would get to make a move. This pawn is actually on the starting row, so it has the option of going 1 or 2. This is one of those times where the pawn would be very smart to just go 1. Because if it goes 1-2, it's back in the firing line of the knight. The knight would go 1-2 turn and capture. However, if we put the pawn back where he came from, the pawn could have just gone 1 square and been safe from the knight. Okay, let's put the knight back on the starting square, and this time we're going to put the pawn on c4. How could the knight capture this pawn in 2 turns? This is another one of those times where the knight does have to be clever on the first turn. If you go running toward the pawn, 1-2 turn, oh no, don't go chasing waterfalls or pawns on c4, because now the knight is too close to the pawn. Let's put the knight back on the starting square. Here, the knight has to move a little bit away from the pawn to be able to come back and capture the pawn. The knight could go 1-2 turn, and then 1-2 turn on the next move. Or, if I put the knight back, the knight could have also gone 1-2 turn, and then on the next turn, 1-2 turn to capture. What about if I make it a little bit harder? Let's put the knight back in the middle, and I'm going to put a pawn right beside the knight. Now, clever YouTube chess kids will notice that because the knight is on a light square and the pawn is on a dark square, the knight is going to have to move an odd number of times. 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, or 1,001 moves. But I'm going to give you a little hint. The knight can capture the pawn in 3 turns. You're going to have to be really, really clever about the way that you do it. Let's see if we can do it. Are you ready? Well, almost any first move with the knight works. I say almost any. Ready? 1, 2, turn. That actually does work. That's move number 1. 1, 2, turn. Move number 2. 1, 2, turn. And on the third move, of course, we capture the pawn. Let's try again. Did you pick 1, 2, turn? If so, good job. 1, 2, turn. Yep. 1, 2, turn. And that totally works. Let's just do one more. How about 1, 2, turn? Yes, sir. 1, 2, turn. Yes, ma'am. 1, 2, turn. And we capture. Okay, now, a really hard question might be, what are the only 2 squares the knight could move to on the first move that would make it impossible to capture the pawn at the end of 3 moves? A bit of a strange question, I totally get that. But if the knight had moved 1, 2, turn, or if the knight had moved 1, 2, turn, notice the knight is 2 squares away diagonal from its target, and this is just one of those weird things about the knight, just like Fun Master Mike's love of tiramisu, just a weird thing. The knight takes 4 turns to move 2 squares away diagonal. So, if you count the first move that we already did, plus 4 more turns, it's actually going to take 5 total moves to capture the pawn. I'm going to let you play around with this to verify and see if Fun Master Mike is telling you the truth. Pro tip, I am. The knight will take 4 more turns to capture the pawn. I'll just do it one random way for you. We could go 1, 2, turn, as crazy as that looks. 1, 2, turn, that's 2 moves. 1, 2, turn, that's 3 moves. 1, 2, turn. And on the 4th move, we would capture. But remember, we also spent a move, so actually, we took 5 moves to capture that pawn in total. All right, just one of those things to remember. It takes the knight 4 turns to go 2 squares away diagonal, which is often too many. That pawn would, of course, run away in the meantime. All right, now the last thing we're going to focus on in our big Knights Tour video. The knight often can attack 2 pieces at once. And in chess, this is such a common tactic that we give it a name. It's called the fork, just like the fork that you eat with. What's that? You eat with chopsticks?
Hello.
Cool. Most of my favorite food is eaten with chopsticks, but today we're using the fork, the fourchette, if you are French. And in this position, my question to you, dear chess kids, where can the knight move to aim at 2 black pieces at once? Well, if you go 1, 2, turn, that totally aims at the queen. 1, 2, turn. But of course, in real life, the queen will just run away and you'll be left with nothing. Wah, wah, wah. Let's go back. the knight could have instead moved to 1, 2, and then turn this way. And look at the majesty of the knight. This knight is now aiming at the queen, and the knight is aiming at the rook. And whichever one black saves, we will simply be able to capture the other one. That's a pretty cool power of the knight. And I bet Richard III could have used that information at the Battle of Bosworth. Sorry, Richard, I know my information is coming 500 years too late, but that was the proper use of the knight. Now, black should probably save the queen, because the queen, of course, is the best piece. And when the queen moves, let's just give her some kind of random square. She moves diagonal. Of course, the knight would then go 1, 2, turn, and the knight would capture the rook. Moving on to this position, this is probably one of the most famous forks in chess. Both sides have brought their pieces out from the beginning position rather normally, but I want you to take very close inspection at this pawn right here. Do you see how the white bishop is ready to grab that pawn? And do you see how the white knight is ready to grab that pawn too? Ooh, white's pieces are working together, the subject of a lot of future ChessKid YouTube videos. Now let's say that black doesn't realize this, and black maybe, I don't know, pushes the pawn. That pawn is getting really eager to capture the knight. However, it's actually making the knight go where it wants to go. The best move for white is to pick up the knight and go 1, 2, turn, and capture this pawn. And now we have a very famous fork. We're aiming at the queen, which, she should save herself, right? She should go to the square e7 and run away. But when the queen does go to e7 to run away, we're going to capture which piece in the next turn? We're not going to capture the pawn, because the pawn is a little guy, and if we capture the pawn, black's pawn could take our knight back, or even the rook could take us back. Hopefully you see both of those moves. Chess is often about planning for your opponent's move as well. The best move is to go 1, 2, turn, and capture the rook, and that was a great fork. The knight was aiming at the queen and the rook, and white was happy to take whichever one black left for dinner. In our final position, the knight is not just the piece that we use for one of the most fun tactics in chess. It's also the piece we use for perhaps the prettiest checkmate in chess. Now, we've mentioned this word checkmate a little bit earlier when I introduced the king. It is, of course, the goal of chess, and it's going to be the subject of a lot of ChessKid puzzles that I hope that you do on the website. However, the knight can play something called the smothered mate. That's right. Some checkmates are such common patterns that we actually give them special names. And when someone smothers you, like, for example, when your mom hasn't seen you in a while, she might smother you with a hug. That means she gives you a really big one, and sometimes you can't even breathe. Well, in chess, if you are smothered by your own pieces, that means your king actually can't move, because the pieces that are trying to help are actually getting in the way. And because the knight can jump over all of those pieces, the knight can deliver a smothered mate. Now, you might be thinking that the first move here is to move the knight 1, 2, turn to make a fork. And if you are thinking that, great job. You just learned what I showed you about 1 minute ago. The knight is aiming at the king, so the king is in check. And the knight is also aiming at the queen. And normally, I would say, bravo, ChessKid, well done, good job, wunderbar. However, in this particular example, I've made it incredibly tricky. Instead of losing the queen, black could actually give up the rook in service of his queen. And then, even if we take the rook and we seem like we are happy, happy, joy, joy, then, this is getting really advanced, I know, the queen could come all the way down and check our king, and our king has nowhere to run away. I guess you could put your queen in the way by bringing her all the way back, but the black queen would just capture the white queen, and you can see that little symbol that came up on the chessboard. White is actually in checkmate. His king cannot move. He can't run away. He can't capture the queen. Oh no, only bad things. Let's go back to our starting position. We're going to hit the big rewind button. The fork is not what we're looking for here. Instead, we're going to play the amazing, the astounding, the unbelievable queen to g8? That looks really weird. Yes, the queen is aiming at the king, but the queen is putting herself in big trouble. Now, first of all, the king can't capture. Remember, when you're in danger, you do have to save your king. That is a requirement. But if the king tries to capture, the computer's going to give me the big flashing red, meaning that's against the rules. If the king tries to capture, notice how the knight is waiting for the king. 1, 2, turn. The black king would be putting himself directly on a square where the knight would be aiming at him, so that doesn't help. In fact, the only move for black is to move the rook to capture the queen. And of course, 99 times out of 100, Funmaster Mike would say, don't just give away your queen. But this is that pretty special exception, the smothered mate. Now that the rook is here, notice how the black king is surrounded or smothered by all of his own pieces. And that makes the black king safe from every single white piece, except for the knight, because the knight can jump over stuff. Now when the knight goes 1, 2 turn, it is a fourchette, but today we are not eating French food. Oh no, we are eating Thai food with chopsticks because we don't even need a fork. We just got ourselves a smothered mate. We're never even going to capture this queen. We're simply aiming at the king, 1, 2 turn. The king can't run away because his pieces are in the way, and I don't see any way for black to be able to capture the knight. And of course, you can't block a knight because the knight just jumps over stuff. Again, Richard III, where were you? I should have taught you that a long time ago. Sorry, the War of the Roses is over. The ChessKid YouTube video is over. Come back soon for more videos where we learn much more advanced ideas, different tactics, different checkmates, and lots more to know about our fun game of chess.